Hi, I'm Dr. Sandra Paulson, an EMDR clinician for a quarter century, also teacher in EMDR advanced workshops, and I've written extensively in the field. And this is Miss Abby, a psychotherapy poodle, one of two, and she decided to join me when I got in front of video, so I'll let her stay. This is the next in my series of brief videos to help EMDR therapists and their clients understand what advanced procedures might be necessary for in order to do a good job with EMDR for people that have complex trauma histories. So far, it's okay, kid. So far, I've talked about ego state therapy, the early trauma approach, and somatic work. Now, I want to say a little bit about how the story tells itself non-verbally. And this is a larger subject. I've spoken on it before. I've got a brief workshop on the subject that I did for EMDR, and I'm going to record it with the Steve Frankel group. It'll be available before long. But what it talks about is that when people have complex trauma histories, often the client's capacity to tolerate at the time of the trauma was overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening to them. It can be either that their capacity was very small because they were little, or even if their capacity was considerable, we all have limits to what we can tolerate. So however the size of our processor is, like if you can have a strong garbage disposal, but if you try to put a brick down it, it's going to break it. And so it is with human beings. We all have our limits. So when we can't tolerate trauma at the time it happens, it gets set aside or dissociated, sort of tucked in a pocket, as one of my clients said, or put away in a closet. If it only happens once, we call that simple PTSD, and the trauma tries to process, like a sliver tries to come out. Have you ever noticed that? That if you have a sliver, you might get part of it out, but then a few weeks later, more of it comes out, and a few weeks later, more of it comes out. That's because the body has an innate healing tendency, and it wants to do the same thing with trauma. So somebody who has PTSD from a fiery car crash will have nightmares and flashbacks because the trauma wants to be processed. It wants to come out and be integrated. When people have complex trauma histories, then standard EMDR is, which would work fine with simple PTSD, it gets more complicated with complex PTSD or dissociation. More and more is out of awareness, not only the memory of the moment of impact with the tractor trailer rig, as in simple PTSD, but family dynamics, the truth about who did what to whom, and how it wasn't a fine, upstanding family. Those are a few common examples of what we hear, those of us that deal with people with histories of trauma in childhood, chronic trauma in childhood. So in that case, how does the story come out? Well, often we can't just go for the story, as I've said in various places and on another one of these. The therapist can't just extract the trauma history without getting permission from the honchos that protect or maybe loyal to the perpetrator's point of view, because that was necessary for survival. So there's that. But it's also true that so much of it may be in implicit memory rather than explicit memory. So let me explain that. The nickel version of that is that with explicit memory, we have pictures, we may have a narrative, we can say, oh yes, I can remember going to so-and-so's wedding when I was 21. But with implicit memory, we don't remember. There's no picture, there's no narrative, but somehow the body may know. So for none of us remembers the first few years. So that's a great example that's an implicit memory, and there may be no pictures and no story. But it also happens when people had to dissociate or put in a closet in the mind's eye that which was overwhelming, couldn't be handled, wasn't safe to handle, wasn't safe to know. And all that information's in there wanting to be processed, as we say in EMDR land, to an adaptive resolution. But the clinician needs to be alert to the myriad ways that the story tells itself, because in addition to verbal narrative story, the story tells itself also through what's called enactments or reenactments, which is when what the client learned to expect from relationships in their family of origin gets reenacted in their life with their job or their husband or wife or friends or with the therapist. And the therapist will have firsthand knowledge from what happens in the room, in the therapy room. So if the therapist and client are having what the therapist thinks is a pleasant conversation, and the client suddenly says, "Oh, I can't do anything right. You must think I'm stupid. You hate me, don't you?" And the therapist is going, "What? I think you're doing just fine." Then the therapist can say to herself or himself, "I wonder if feeling stupid, that you can't do anything right, or that you're despised, is part of your story." Or as I like to say as an ego state therapist, part of baby's story. Because that gives the adult self an objective glance at baby, and it also gives a voice and touches deeply the client's hurt child states. So that's one example, enactments or reenactments. Those words are sometimes used interchangeably, although I think they also might be distinguishable. But for our purposes here, I want to go on to the story might tell itself in the therapist's mirror neurons. Not every therapist can do this, but a lot of us, when you've been sitting there for a quarter century and you turn into some kind of Stradivarius in terms of being able to discern in this instrument, the therapist's body, what's happening across the room in the client's body. I know it sounds strange, but there's actually science behind it, and it's called mirror neurons. Google it. Mirror neurons are what primates have, both as a basic way of learning. A primate can see through modeling how another chimp is peeling a banana, and they get the hang of it and imitate it. But moreover, in humans, mirror neurons are the basis of empathy and attunement and resonance. So it's very important for us social humans. And you can imagine in child rearing, it's very important for a mother to be able to discern her baby's distress. But a therapist might be sitting with a client, and the therapist might say, "And do you have any feelings about what happened when your parents divorced at age 5, when you were age 5? And the client may have a bland look on his or her face and say, "Not really, long time ago." And the therapist is sitting there scanning her own Stradivarius or seismograph, what metaphor you want to think about it, and go, "Oh, well then why is there a crushing weight on the chest?" And the therapist can say with curiosity, "Is there something on the chest? I'm happy to be wrong. You're the world's leading authority on how you feel." And it often happens in my office that either right away or within a couple minutes, the client is aware of that they actually do have feelings. They might be in tears at that point. So that's another way the story tells itself. There's much more to it. I mean, clinical intuition, I sometimes see words in an old-fashioned typewriter font that if I just have the courage to read it and say any reason why I might be seeing the word such and so, the client will often say, "Oh yeah, because it either applies to how they're feeling or it's a fact from their life. And I don't begin to understand how that works, but it's another way the story tells itself. There's a lot more to say on this subject. It touches on clinical intuition and science both, but that's the highlights of it, and someday I'll complete that workshop. Thanks for listening. Oh, BainbridgePsychology.com is the website. Bye-bye.